And what I would like to do is begin by exploring, these two key concepts of stress and mindfulness. They're both in the title of what we're talking about today, and both very much a part of what's brought us here. So we'll spend some time looking at those. What I particularly like to do then is to look at the Buddhist aspect of these particular things, stress and mindfulness. Mindfulness comes out of Buddhism. It's taken a more secular or everyday sort of approach. We'll talk about that. But I'd really like to point back towards Buddhism itself. I think it has something extra to offer beyond perhaps what some forms of secular mindfulness does, but I don't see that as a competition either. We take what works for us, and at the end of the day, I think that's the most important thing. So, my name's Michael. I work as a bereavement counsellor at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital and Concord Hospital. That means I work in palliative care, and I see people after somebody's died, people who feel that they need some extra support and help along the way. We also see people where somebody has died and it's not a palliative care death, so it might be a death at home or some other sort of death of any sort, really. So that's what I do in my 5 days a week when I'm working. So there's a number of ways we can go with this. I think it might be useful very briefly just to situate mindfulness within the context of Buddhism, but I'll bring it back to the way it's understood in everyday life, just in the various programs that are taught around the world, and then we'll move on and do a few other things from there into little practice as well. So, just very briefly, we think about the Buddhist Path. It's often called the Eightfold Path. Now, if people need some paper and pens, we have some here, and it would be great. I'm going to ask you to write some things down later on, so great to have a piece of paper and a pen. There is a path of practice, and mindfulness is one aspect of that practice. It fits into the meditation or concentration category, but it's not the totality of practice. So there are other practices as well. So we have, broadly speaking, mindfulness and concentration in this thing that's called the Eightfold Path. Now these are practices that link together but are somewhat separate as well. So we wouldn't want to see concentration over here and mindfulness over here. They link up together, but they have slightly different purposes. And I think it's really important to understand this from the start. Many of you will know this already, but it may be useful to go over again. Broadly speaking, very broadly, concentration practice is a practice or a range of practices that bring the mind to we could say one point, bring it together. So when the mind is brought together in this particular way, it's very useful in terms of producing a number of responses. So in a very sort of secular, everyday way, if we can bring our attention to something that's tranquilizing, and we'll do this later on, something that's calming, it usually feels good. But the very act of collecting the mind in this way itself produces pleasant feelings. So you think about any activity where we're focused on something. Now, it might be playing guitar, it might be swimming, it might be playing a sport, it could be painting, lots of things. And often there is a feeling of pleasure, it's enjoyable. I often think that if aliens looked down on the planet and saw people playing rugby league, and then were told it was pleasurable for them, really, what is that about? But I think the act of the mind drawing together, of coming together in this sort of way, produces pleasure. I'm sure you can think of experiences yourself where you find certain things in your life pleasurable, and if you reflect on them, I suspect that for some of those things at least, this is the mind being present to a particular thing in this open and relaxed sort of way. And this leads to tranquility, calmness, and is a foundation for other practices, other meditation practices. When most people think about meditation, I'm not sure about everybody here, that's the one they think of. And when they think of that, the next thing people often say is, well, I can't meditate because I can't concentrate my mind. I can't stop thinking, therefore I'm really bad at meditation and I think I'll try yoga instead or something like that. So that's only partly true perhaps, because that's just one aspect of meditation practice. The other form of meditation practice is mindfulness. So mindfulness is this ability to be on looking towards whatever's in our experience. Now, whatever's in our experience might be felt in the body, or something happening in terms of our feelings, but it might be something external to us as well. So we could be mindful of driving on the road, for example. We'll talk more about this as we go along. So if we look at both those practices, I'm going to expand out on these later. If we look at both of those practices, we will recognise almost straight away they must be conjoined in a sort of a way. If we want to focus on one thing, we have to notice when the mind is wandering off. We have to be mindful of when the mind is wandering. When we are mindful in this very broad way of our experience, there is a level of concentration in there as well. The major difference then, if we understand that, is that mindfulness in a Buddhist practice is about producing insight, seeing into who we are or how we are in the world. So it's an insight practice, a seeing into. And the word that commonly comes up in Buddhism with mindfulness is vipassana. Vipassana means something like to see variously. We're seeing the bits and pieces of our experience. Rather than being caught up with something and carried away, we're present to our experience. So this is a basic connection and also difference between these two practices. So if you reflect on whatever you've been doing, you might go, well, that's a calmness, a tranquility, a concentration practice. That's a part of Buddhism and a part of many other religious traditions too. Or I'm predominantly going towards a mindfulness or insight practice of investigating my experience in a particular sort of way, which we'll talk about more. And what you're doing is probably one of those two things, or usually a mixture of the two actually. But as I say, most people think about meditation, they think it's concentration. They have to exclude things from their experience. Mindfulness has a much more open sort of capacity, but it certainly has a goal, and the goal is insight. And it's actually insight into something that the Buddha called suffering, and I'll come back to that a bit later. I thought what we could do is to have a look at a very modern version of what people understand by mindfulness. So I've got some handouts for you. I hope I produced enough. Tim, would you mind?
No.
Maybe Kevin, if you'd mind doing the other half as well. You should, it's not quite hard for you,
Actually, I could probably get you like this one.
And as you get those, you might like to have a look through and we'll talk a bit about them.
Everyone's got one? Perfect.
Have a go. So I haven't got one, but I can do this by memory, I think. No, thanks, Tina. The first bit says mindfulness means something. And it says paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So we'll just pause for that first bit you've got with me. That's lovely. This is a definition that comes from a guy called Jon Kabat-Zinn. Jon Kabat-Zinn is really the man in the United States who kick-started this modern mindfulness movement. When we said it's everywhere, it's happening now. He's the guy who started it back in the 70s. So he worked in a clinic with patients who were suffering and stressed. He was also a guy that was very into yoga practice, went on insight meditation retreats at a lovely place in the States, and was also very involved in Korean Zen as well. In fact, ran a centre, very famous Korean Zen master for a while too. So on one of these retreats, Jon Kabat-Zinn had this insight that was, I think I could use some of these practices for my patients who are suffering, the patients at the medical centre where I work. So he spoke to one of the teachers there who basically gave him the thumbs up and said, go for it. And so he created this thing called mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. There's lots of variations on that theme these days, lots of M's. mindfulness-based stuff. Mindfulness-based stress reduction. So it's interesting for us here, he was keenly focused on stress, which is what we're talking about today. But in Buddhism, as we'll find out in a minute, very keenly focused on stress as well. So there's a natural crossover between the two. So he created an 8-week program designed for people who were pretty much, there wasn't much more the medical system could do with them. The reason he didn't call it meditation was because back in the 70s, and probably the 80s and the 90s as well, if in a health institution you mentioned the word meditation, your colleagues wouldn't look very kindly upon it. And people just thought it was a bit weird and odd. It's what hippies did, and there wasn't a real understanding of it. So we called it mindfulness, which is a translation of a word sati, or insight. We'll come back to that in a minute. So mindfulness-based stress reduction. Now it's spread around the world. It's become all sorts of things. We haven't got time to go into all that today. But for our purposes, it's not a bad definition. So let's have a look at it. Paying attention. And so the key point of mindfulness is we're attending to something. Now we know in Buddhism it's this fathom-long body, the whole world. So we're paying attention to our world, the world as we experience it. And then he goes on to say, well, how do we do this? It's all very well to say, look, just pay attention. How do we do that? What's the activity that happens when we're doing that? And the first bit is on purpose. That is clearly about choice. We choose to pay attention. And choice is not something that's just done once. It's successive, over and over and over and over and over. So we continually choose to be present to what's happening at an area that we choose to pay attention to, whether it be the breath or the body or something else as well. So we do it on purpose. So there's choice involved in this. So there's a bit of effort. Wherever there's choice, there's effort. And effort is one of the, it's on the path of practice, right effort it's called. So it takes some effort, and ongoing effort to pay attention, to be attentive. In the present moment. I'd probably drop the word moment there for various reasons, just in the present. In the present, here and now. There's a lot we could say about this, and probably will. But where are things really happening? Where is our life actually happening? Here. Here and now. There is nowhere else that our life is happening. This is it, folks. This is it. Right now. Now, that's not to say that we can't remember the past or anticipate the future. We do that all the time. But when we remember the past and anticipate the future, when is that happening? Now. Just now. I'm going to explore that further as well. So it's this quality of nowness, of presence of mind that was mentioned by a few people that's tremendously important here. There's certainly an aspect of this where we have to remember to pay attention. We need cues to remind us, and we'll be talking about that later today. How do we remember to pay attention? How do we remember to be present to our actual lives? In Buddhism there's a saying that goes, the past is gone, the future is yet to come. Now is the knowing. Ajahn Sumedho, a very famous Western monk who trained in Thailand, was very fond of saying this. The past is gone, the future is yet to come. Now is the knowing. We can't know and partake in our life anywhere else. So this mindfulness is about being present to our lives here and now. What we do with that is another question. You know, what our goal is, how we apply it, okay, that's a different thing again. But this is basically absolutely right. It's happening now. And this last point is probably the most challenging of all the points on this sheet of paper here, and that's non-judgmentally. How do we do this? Non-judgmentally. This has been massively misinterpreted by people around the world, I think. There's been a lot of debate about this. It doesn't mean not to have judgments. Of course we have judgments. This is what we are as human beings. You know, we have simple judgments about whether we want to stand up or sit down. We have judgments about how close we want to sit to somebody. We have judgments about how much we want to eat. We have judgments about how long we want to sit with our legs crossed or not. We'd be a bit lost without our judgments. So we should know from the start that judgments aren't the issue. If judgments come into our mind when we're meditating, it's really no problem. Unless we start making judgments about the judgments. I shouldn't have these judgments. I'm a dreadful meditator. Look at that person next to me. Look at Zen up the back there, meditating like a full-blown yogi. Unbelievable. He's so much better than I am. And the problem with the second level of judgments, and I'm going to come back to this later again too, is that they just carry us away. Then we're lost. We're really not present to our experience. And the issue there is that once we've done that, we tend to repeat that pattern of mind, and we repeat it, and it becomes a habit. So we become habitually lost in particular sorts of judgments. Usually about how good we think we are, how bad we think we are. They're usually comparison judgments. Us as opposed to other people, how we'd like to be, how we aren't, and so forth. So judgments are fine, it's just getting lost in them that really is the issue for us here as well. It goes on here to talk a bit more about flesh out a bit more some of the qualities. So non-judging we've talked about a little bit. Patience. This is probably the hardest one for Westerners. I'm not sure about the group here, but we're so impatient, especially I think with social media now. Everything has to happen fairly immediately. It's hard to stay with things for very long. I think I notice this on longer retreats or even 2 or 3 day retreats. People find it very difficult these days to stay present in any sort of way for more than a few minutes. Where's the payoff? And if there's no immediate payoff, it's pretty difficult to stay there. Beginner's mind we talked a bit about. This is the Zen mind, beginner's mind. Each moment truly is a new moment. We've never experienced this moment before. Each moment is a new moment. I think sometimes we're so focused on getting past our moments that we sort of miss them on the way through. We're so worried about things going wrong. We're so stressed. I sometimes think it's a bit like we get to the end of our lives and go, phew, I got through that okay. I didn't see much of it, but boy, I got through it okay. So the freshness of beginner's mind opens us up to what's happening here and now. But having said that, when we open up to the present, it's not all pleasant. There is difficult stuff. And this is often why people shy away from mindfulness practice, because it does open us up to where the suffering really is, where it lives. So a little cautionary note, we should take this reasonably carefully, just step by step, gradually dipping your toe in the water, just gradually. Because I've been in long retreats and it's very typical to see people come in and their practice is immaculate for 2 or 3 days and then they're gone. Overnight usually they disappear. They can't sustain it. They haven't dipped their toe in the water. They've confronted too much suffering usually. Often it's physical, but often it's emotional or psychological, social, and off they go. It's been too much too soon. So gently with the mindfulness practice. There's enough stress already, as I said. Pain is unavoidable. Suffering is optional. So you don't need to add to it. Just over the page, trust. Trusting in our own ability that we have what it takes to meditate to whatever level. To be a witness of our own experience, which is essentially what mindfulness is, being a witness to our own experience. Non-striving. This is an interesting one because in a sense we are putting effort. So what does it mean, non-striving? It actually means that things are just the way they are. This is a tough one, isn't it? Because often we don't want things to be just the way they are. We want them to be other than they are. So there's nothing wrong with planning and changing what's going on, but that usually begins with one very important step, which is going, this is how things are now. The reality factor. Rather than going, no, this is not the way it is, I refuse to believe it's the way it is, I'm going to work frantically or medicate myself just to get away from the way things are. This is actually the way things are now, and with that knowledge of how things are, we can actually plan intelligently should we want to change how things are. This is a very difficult one to come to, I think. This is just the way it is. In this human body, human mind, this is just the way it is. It comes with the package. Acceptance. This is a tough word for people, and I sometimes will use the word acknowledgement instead of acceptance. Acceptance has some baggage attached to it, like I should accept what's going on, but I really don't like it, but Michael's sitting up the front and I should accept it. I don't want to let him see that I'm not accepting what's going on. But if we acknowledge, that's just a factual thing, isn't it? I don't like it, but this is the way it is. So I rarely use the word acceptance. Certainly with my clients, the people I see professionally, I never use the word acceptance. Ever. Acknowledgement. Letting go, and again I change this slightly and put letting be. Just letting things be. Letting go is too much of an activity sometimes. Just letting things be is maybe a place to start. And you can have those copies to take away with you. There's that one you can have if you want to. Yes. So we just pause for a moment. Thoughts about that, reflections, feedback, what are we thinking so far? Yep, yep, okay, thumbs up, that's good, I've got a thumbs up. Excellent.
Simple but not easy.
That's beautifully said, simple but not easy. Absolutely, yes, yeah. It's actually quite simple, really. It's but there's a level of profundity and profoundness when you go into it that it just keeps opening up. But how do we go back to it is the question. So mindfulness in Buddhism is this thing called sati. It comes particularly from a sutra or sutta called the Satipatthāna Sutta. It's the setting up of mindfulness. It's how do we cultivate mindfulness is what it's about. It talks about 4 foundations and it's quite technical in a way. But broadly speaking, mindfulness is about seeing into, as I said before, our experience, the body and the mind. It's very simple in that sense, sati mindfulness. And it has this sense of being on-looking. So an image that's given in the sutras or sutras is of a gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper, there are 4 gates that he has to look after. And people come to those 4 gates and want to get to the centre of the city. And so the gatekeeper's job is to pay attention, to be alert and so forth, to know who's coming in and to let in the appropriate people and to direct them appropriately. So the gatekeeper has quite a lot of tasks to perform. He's got to vet the people that come along, he's got to remember where they're going, he's got to remember which way to go, he's got to, maybe redirect people who've gone in the wrong direction. This is an image that's given for mindfulness, and I think it's very useful because it tells us that mindfulness is a little different to focus or attention. Mindfulness has a breadth of attention about what's going on. Sometimes people think mindfulness is about burrowing into one thing and excluding everything else. So for people who've been around the Buddhist scene for a little bit, you'll know that in Burma, in one of the practices, it's about noticing the rise and fall of the abdomen. And people will often hear that and go, okay, I must burrow into the rise and fall, all the sensations, but exclude everything else. This is slightly different again. It's moving very close to a concentration practice. There is, of course, mindfulness in there as well. But mindfulness, I think if we go back to the sutras, or early Buddhism, it has this breadth, this overlooking quality. Mindfulness then has all these other qualities that it's conjoined with as well. Wise attention is the main one. We're wisely attending to particular things as they come up. So we have this breadth of attention. I'm here, this is my environment, this is my inner landscape, this is my outer landscape. I'm awake to it. And now I choose to place my attention here. I'm attending to this particular thing, but I don't lose touch with everything. And a good rule of thumb about this, about knowing something about mindfulness, is if you've been mindful, it's very likely that when you go out to talk to somebody later on about something, you will remember. Even though you might have been attending to a particular thing, you have a breadth of awareness, of wakefulness. If you haven't been mindful, if you've been too burrowed into one particular thing, the rise and fall or the breath, it's going to be very hard to remember to talk about it because you're really focused on one thing and everything else is excluded. So mindfulness really doesn't want to exclude too much at all. It wants to be present to what actually is. I've used the word wakefulness a few times, and for people who aren't aware of this, the root of the word Buddha is to be awake or to wake up. The one who is awakened. We often use the word enlightened, but I think a useful word is the word awake. So we're waking up to our experience. It's pretty hard to be wakeful, isn't it? Very hard to be wakeful. Sit down for 4 or 5 minutes and try and be wakeful and you drift off very easily. So again, it's simple but difficult to do maybe. So we're waking up to our present experience in this broad sort of way and then attending to particular things. We're going to talk about stress in relation to Buddhism in just a moment, but I'd like to invite you now to think about what stresses you out, what your major stresses are. And I'd like you to write those down. Now, you don't have to share these. This is for you. We're going to use these during the day just for yourselves. So take a few minutes and, just tune in a little bit and go, okay, when I think about this, what are maybe 4 or 5 stressors, ongoing stressors in my life? What stresses me? The second part of this is when you're stressed, how do you know you're stressed? What are your symptoms of stress? And again, you don't have to share these around, but what are the symptoms that tell you that you're stressed? I think it's quite useful to go through this and to, we sort of know how we react, but to write it down and to put it out there as a way of clarifying and becoming mindful of, oh, this is actually what I do, and it can help just to write these things down. At least we know the territory that we're walking in now, that we're dealing with, And when we come to talk more about mindfulness, that'll give us a goal at the end point we're aiming at as well, and we can choose a practice that's appropriate to the sorts of things we've just written down as well. Yeah, so that's very good. The past or the future. As I was saying before, the past is gone, the future is yet to come, but we don't act that way. Yes. And anxiety really is always about the future, isn't it? True. It's the what if. What if. And it's the what if, and I'm not up to it. Because really that's what anxiety is. We get frantic then trying to manage it before we get there. So the mind is restless, I suppose, distracted, moving around in a sort of superficial and shallow way. We can't go very deep into anything. So with the people I see, for example, it's absolutely typical that their sleep is disrupted. They're usually waking up about 3 in the morning, worrying about what's happened or the future. Their short-term memory is usually impaired. You walk into a room and go, what did I come in here for? Where did I put that teapot? Why is it in the fridge? That sort of thing, because I put it there last time not thinking, I wasn't really present. And ability to concentrate usually is impaired when people are very stressed. And so the ability to, say, read a paragraph in a book and retain it, for many people I see, is almost impossible. So this is quite strong stress, yeah. So shared by a lot of us. It's a very common human response, isn't it? Everybody's nodding as we're saying this. So yes, and it's the culture that we're in as well, so that's a great point. So it's can be work-related stress, and it can be stress of the particular work culture or general culture that we're in as well. Yes, so definitely. I think a lot of people are here perhaps because of work-related stress. I see a lot of people because of work-related stress, yeah. And that's quite a serious level of work-related stress too, yes. Financial situation, sure, yeah. Absolutely, yes. More and more these days, I think, too. You think about people trying to buy houses, for example, at the moment, or pay off a HEX loan, something like that. These are huge stressors, yeah. Sort of external stressors, but we still bear the brunt of them. Yeah. Look, I think it's really important at this point to note that stress is not always bad. So it's a generic term that means we're aroused in some sort of way. But we want to differentiate here between chronic and acute stress. So acute stress is stress that's responsive to a particular situation. An extreme example of that would be if we're travelling, if we're going through the South Africa and we're on a safari and a lion comes towards us, we would like to be acutely stressed at that point because we may need to do something rather urgently. And what we may need to do at that point is to run or to fight. It's called the fight or flight response. Every sentient being pretty much has that, the fight or flight response. It's enormously useful. Okay, so you're going to say, Michael, I'm not likely to go trekking in the Transvaal or whatever, so, what point, how is that useful for me? I was walking out along the road here before. There's a lot of very fast traffic going along there, whizzing along. I would love to know that I can have a stress response to jump out of the way should I need to. What I don't need when a car is barrelling down on me is to go, Michael, that large object there looks like a car. It's bigger than me, so it probably weighs you, bang, you're gone. What you want is this automatic response. There's the body working perfectly when it does that, a fight or flight response. Somebody once sort of paraphrased that as to have lunch or be lunch. To have lunch or be lunch. So it's a very useful survival mechanism. There is another aspect of the fight or flight response, and it's the freeze syndrome, where we get stuck. When either physically or mentally we can't move from where we are, where our resources are completely overwhelmed. You know, there's an old saying about the rabbit in the glare of the headlights. You know, it just gets frozen like this. And when we're majorly stressed, we can have that freeze response. But broadly speaking, acute stress, with stress hormones flooding through the body such that the body reacts in certain sorts of ways, absolutely fine. So we know we're stressed when we have acute stress because the heart rate might go up very, very quickly. It can double or triple very, very quickly, which it sometimes needs to do. We may feel sick or like we need to go to the toilet. And those things may actually happen involuntarily. The body's trying to rid itself of any excess baggage so it can run or fight. There's some stress hormones released that give us access to our energy, to our fuel very quickly, particularly around the major muscle groups. There's a whole cascade of stress responses that in fact are pretty useful. So, and in fact at a much more minor level, we had to be stressed to get here today. You could not have gotten out of bed unless there was some sort of small stress response. You would still be in bed as jellyfish otherwise. So we need to be somewhat aroused to be able to move around, to think, to act, to respond. This, if we didn't have it, we'd really be in trouble. The issue for us is not so much acute stress, it's chronic stress. So we think back to John Kabat-Zinn's patients, for example, many people carrying illnesses for many, many, many years and becoming majorly stressed. But people who are depressed or anxious, carrying that across a period of time. So the difference between chronic and acute stress, again, very, very in a simple way, is that acute stress ramps us up so we're ready to, you know, have lunch or be lunch, and it should come down very quickly. I don't know how many people have watched David Attenborough on television, those nature documentaries. Yeah, right. And you may have seen Zebra, and you'll see they're being hunted by maybe a lion, and the zebra will get very twitchy and then they take off really quickly. But as soon as the lion has either caught one of them or they get away, they just stop and they start eating grass again. And their stress response is very acute, but it comes down very quickly. What happens for us when we're stressed with chronic stress is that stress level never really comes down. We have stress hormones running around the body. We get habituated to being stressed. We can feel stressed by not being stressed. Oh, if I relax too much, I'm going to be in trouble here. So, and we keep certain stress levels going because we never know what's going to hurt us. For somebody who's been abused or dreadful things have happened over a period of time, what have they learned? Don't relax. You know, be hypervigilant, be looking around, be looking to the future, make sure nothing bad happens. You know, remember the past, say you don't forget, and you're looking all the time. You can't relax. Much more chronic stress, and so the levels of stress just keep kicking in over time. This is extraordinarily bad for the body, and it becomes a habit. It becomes habituated. We need to break that cycle. The good news about mindfulness meditation and meditation generally is that what people find, initially this has been reported on by so many people, is that their stress levels tend to come down a lot faster. They still get stressed. They don't turn into zombies, which is something people have asked me from time to time. Will I become a zombie if I meditate? But their stress levels start coming down a lot faster. We relearn how to let go. It's something we have to relearn, again, bit by bit by bit, so we feel safe with it as well. Thoughts about that, about stress reactions, acute and chronic? So what we're dealing with here is chronic stress. It's not the only thing we're dealing with, of course, but it's what we're talking about today. I'm going to do a practice in just a moment, but I just want to give you just a taste of what the Buddha said about stress and about being a human being. His statements about stress are contained in what's called, all through the sutras or the teachings, the Four Noble Truths. The word he uses for stress is dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, dukkha. Not the beautiful spice, another dukkha, the one that's not so pleasant usually. And here he's talking more about stress reactions and more about chronic stress as well. The stress of being human. So he has four noble truths. He said, here's the first one, I'll just read you a little bit of it. He asked the various people he's talking to, what is the noble truth of suffering, of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness? He says, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, I'm learning about that one, sickness is suffering, dissociation from the loved, that's being separated from the loved, is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, all of our experience that we cling to or get caught up with is suffering. He says this is to be understood. So this word dukkha, we need to probably have a quick think about that. Dukkha, I believe, comes from the root, something meaning like an axle that fits into the wheel. You know, the big old ox carts, have you ever seen those? And the axle's usually wood or something, and it grinds a bit, and there's, they use fat or whatever to make it turn. So dukkha is like the wheel that's not turning properly on the axle. It grinds. It doesn't fit properly. It's not quite right. It makes squeaking sounds. I was in Burma once walking around through the forest with some monks, and an ox cart came around the corner, and it was like stepping back 2,500 years to the time of the Buddha, and there was this squeaky wheel on the ox cart. I thought, that's dukkha. The axle that's not greased properly. So what do we do with mindfulness? We're greasing the axle so it doesn't, so our lives don't hurt so much. Dukkha is often translated as suffering. That's useful. It's translated as stress. So there's a monk in America who's very fond of using that particular word, and that broadens it out a bit. The other word that's often used is unsatisfactoriness. Sort of a long word, isn't it? Unsatisfactoriness. Why is it unsatisfactory? Well, it comes to that second point of what we do with our experience. We try and hang on to it or get rid of it. We want more of it, we want to get rid of it. In Buddhism, that's called clinging. Craving and clinging. We want to hang on to our experience. And this causes extra stress for us because at heart, and I ask you this question now, is there anything that we can truly hold on to that's unchanging? Anything? I haven't found anything in my experience in this fathom-long body and lots of explorations. I haven't found anything. And yet we go on attempting to hold on to things or to push things away. And I'm going to talk more about that after we have a little break. So this is the second part of stress. The first is the givens of being human. We've got a body, there's something we call a mind, and there is going to be some level of stress or suffering. It's built into the package. We're bought into it. In a sense, it's unavoidable, but we can live skillfully, so certainly we reduce that. But, I've got nerves in my leg. If I bump into something, it's going to hurt. So there is that level of dukkha, if you like. Probably equally important here, or even more important, to notice that the Buddha said, there is suffering. So it seemed to be sort of universal. It's just something that we have. It's not, I am suffering so dreadfully, it's all about me, my suffering is more than yours. We don't want to cling on to it as mine. It's a shared thing. We share in this unsatisfactoriness, things changing. So there's the physical, the world, and there's what we do with the world, our relationship with the world. And that's the bit we can really work on. The relationship we have with our experience with the past and the future, for example. The relationship with our friends, with our work colleagues. The relationship we have with our patients. And also, most importantly, the relationship we have with ourselves. I've thrown a lot of information at you this morning. I think we should do a practice. In the sutras that talk about mindfulness, interestingly, they always start off with a particular practice, which is calming, tranquilizing the body and mind. It's been overlooked very much in the last 20 or 30 years in the West, but this is where it all starts. So we're not trying to change our relationship, we're just bringing our attention to something that's inherently soothing, that calms us down, that helps the heart stop beating so fast.